in 2013, I had a job in downtown Boston, which meant that every single morning I left my house at 5 a.m. I drove 20 minutes over to the local bus station and I got on a commuter bus to head into the city very, very early in the morning to beat the commuter traffic. I would take the early bus in, I would take the early bus out so that I didn't have to spend 6 hours a day commuting between my house and Boston. So I ended up getting into Boston very early in the morning, and most days this was great. This was not great on the day that they were hunting down the Boston Marathon bomber, because what happened on that day, first of all, I was actually at the Boston Marathon bombing. Me and my husband were there. We were at the finish line, and thank God that we were not hurt. We were about a block and a half away from the second bomb when it went off, and we were very, very lucky and very, very blessed that nothing happened to us, and it was honestly one of the most insane, traumatic things that I have ever been a part of. But what happened in Boston the week after the marathon bombing is that there were, I have never seen so many armed soldiers stationed literally everywhere. Anywhere that you would walk, anywhere there was public transportation, there were people with big guns standing everywhere as they were hunting for the Boston Marathon bombers. And some of the most vivid memories I have are on the Friday after the Boston Marathon bombing, when I was commuting down to the city. I had arrived at the bus station at 5 a.m. I got on my 5:30 a.m. bus. I was on the bus. We were on our way to the city. And as we were on our way to the city, the police ordered the entire city closed. They ordered all public transportation to stop. They ordered all people to stay in their house. I was already on my way to the city. There was no way. They didn't turn the bus around. So we continued to drive in. We went right into South Station in Boston, and they told us to get off the bus, and they promptly told us to get out of the building and to go shelter in place. Well, how are you supposed to, as a group full of commuters, shelter in place? So there were all these commuters all over the place around downtown Boston who literally had nowhere to go. And so there were groups of us just hanging out on the sidewalk in the middle of the city. And even I'll read this story from NPR. Mass transit service in Boston area was suspended on Friday morning. So was taxi service for the first few hours of the day. It wasn't for the first few hours of the day. I'll tell you that in a second. Drivers were told to stay off the streets in Watertown. It wasn't just in Watertown. Businesses were told not to open. Boston city officials asked residents to please go home and not congregate at bus stops or other places. Just after 8 a.m., it was actually earlier than that, officials said the shelter-in-place advisory had been extended to the entire city of Boston. Now, what I experienced as a commuter that was there again at 6:30 a.m. in the morning, where there were groups of us congregating on the sidewalk, and we literally didn't have anywhere to go. And one of the most vivid memories that I have of that time was there was a 13 or 14-year-old kid that was he had taken the bus to Boston. It was the first leg of his journey. And in South Station, he was supposed to get on another bus to go out to Springfield. And all of a sudden, everyone was just telling him, well, just, you can't even be in the bus station. And he was standing around on the sidewalk. And as a group of us were standing there, these police officers came up and they just started yelling at us, start walking out of town, start walking out of town. And I wasn't so much scared for me, but this 14-year-old kid literally just started walking out of town. Now, the length between Boston, Massachusetts and Springfield, Massachusetts, when you were driving in a car is about 2 hours. And so then people asked, well, can we get people to come pick us up? And the police were like, no. And even when we were standing there, a car drove up to try to pick someone up, and the police came over and started banging on the car and started telling them, you have to go, you can't stop here, you can't pick people up, because they were looking for this guy. But I will never forget the look on the face of that 14-year-old kid that literally was being screamed at by the police. He had done nothing wrong. All he was doing was standing there. He was being screamed at by the police to start walking out of the city. And I was lucky because my office was just a few blocks away from South Station, and eventually I wrangled a group of people and we went over and we just kind of hung out in my office. And I was also lucky that I had coworkers there, and some of them had driven their cars down, and so eventually we were able to kind of split the group up among us, and so everyone was able to get home that night, because literally they were not letting cars in and out of Boston. I honestly thought that I was going to have to sleep in my office that night because they were not allowing you to go in to get hotels. They weren't allowed, like, if you didn't have a home in Boston, you were SOL that you could walk to, because you weren't allowed to take public transportation or anything like that. So it all turned out to be fine, but that whole experience left a pretty indelible mark on my memory of what can happen when we allow authoritarianism to take over in times of crisis. Now, again, I was at the marathon bombing. There were, I wanted this jackass caught. But how many of our liberties were we willing to give up in pursuit of that? And by the way, it turns out the dude was hiding in a boat all day long. Like, that's where he was. He was nowhere near us. So therefore, shutting down the entire city of Boston, which is a big, expansive area, I mean, maybe it could argue they did a little bit of good. I don't know, man. I think they still would have caught him anyway. And I was thinking about that a lot this morning when I saw this article from the Detroit Free Press. Michigan is now banning travel between residences, with few exceptions. After Friday, Michigan residents will no longer be able to jump in the car or cross the street to visit friends and relatives inside the state or go to their cottage up north. So if someone has a vacation home in Michigan or a second home or, another piece of property, they are now not allowed to go from one piece of property that they own to another piece of property that they own. Now, if you don't own a second piece of property, well, first of all, if you don't live in Michigan, you might think, no big deal. If you don't own a second piece of property, you might think, no big deal. This doesn't apply to me. Those people have two pieces of property. They're just rich people anyway, and why should they get to have two places to go when I only have one? I mean, that might be what you're thinking, but let's read about this and just think about it for a second. This is one of the major changes Governor Gretchen Whitmer's stay-home order issued Thursday, which also extends the expiration of the order to May 1st. Until now, travel between two Michigan residences has been permitted. Beginning Saturday, that will end except for the purpose of caring for a relative, an elderly friend, or a pet, or visiting a nursing home or similar facility, attending a funeral with no more than 10 people, or complying with a court order related to child custody. All public and private gatherings of any size are prohibited, Whitmer said at a news conference. People can still leave their house for outdoor activities, and outdoor recreation activities are still permitted as long as they're taking place outside of 6 feet from anyone else. People will still be able to travel to other residents outside of the state, but not to cottages or vacation rentals inside the state. Teresa Karen, a resident of southeastern Clare County north of Mount Pleasant, said she likes the fact that the order would prohibit people from Metro Detroit, where the virus is infecting people in large numbers, from staying at cottages in her area where there are a few cases. Wait for it. Our hospitals are ill-equipped to handle a surge, she says. However, Carson is angry about the closure of nurseries and garden centers. She says that it's time for her to plant her peas and broccoli and cauliflower and carrots, food that she and her family will eat all winter. If she can't plant if those outlets are closed. These businesses are essential to us. And here is where we start to discover the problem. Because when you are not willing to stand up for other people's liberties, for other people's freedoms, simply because they don't inconvenience you, then do not expect them to stand up for your liberties and your freedoms when it does not inconvenience them. So Teresa here is completely cool with the fact that their state is saying if you own property, you are not allowed to travel to it. But when they tell her you can't plant your garden, she's like, oh, clutching my pearls. No, that we can't possibly do that. This is essential. Well, maybe, Teresa, maybe some people travel to their vacation home or their other piece of property is essential to them. You need to stop thinking about what is outside of your own self-interest, folks, and look at the bigger picture. If they can infringe on my liberties, that means they can infringe on yours, and I will defend your liberties until, like, my dying breath. I really will, because I will say that's not right, that's not fair. But you've got to stand up for mine too, man. We are in this together. We're in this together. We've got to be looking out for each other. We've got to be protecting each other. I don't think it's okay at all that people are not allowed to go to their own piece of property. It just absolutely does not make sense. And look, they're going to be punished with a civil fine of up to $1,000 for going to your own piece of property. You know, I did a video the other day about, people paddleboarding in the middle of the ocean by themselves getting arrested, and the mayor of Los Angeles offering bribes to people for reporting on their neighbors. When are we going to speak up and say this is going too far? When is enough enough? I don't know. We'll see. Thankfully I live in New Hampshire, which is like the live free or die state, and so we're not actually having to deal with this nonsense yet, but just because it's not inconveniencing me yet doesn't mean I'm not thinking about it, and it doesn't mean I'm not worried about it, and it doesn't mean I'm not speaking up about it. So if you're not okay with this, folks, you gotta express yourself. You have to speak up. The people with power in any situation, it's not based on who holds the highest office or who ranks the highest in the organization. The people who have the most power in any social situation are the people who are speaking up, the people who are expressing themselves, the people who are saying what they want to say. Don't ever complain about something if you're not willing to speak up about it. Express what you believe. When you express what you believe, you're going to find other people who believe the same thing. But you can't be afraid. They haven't taken away our right to freedom of speech yet. God knows. So now's the time to use it.